I've done a lot of solo country in my time. The snowy high plains, the Warrumbungles, 3 nights out behind Bald Rock with nothing but a compass and a topo map that turned out to be 20 years out of date. I'm not someone who gets rattled easy. I want to put that on the table before I say any of this, because I know how it sounds. This was a section of New England I'd been meaning to get into for years. A valley system that drops off the back of the main escarpment, well east of the sealed roads, where the country folds in on itself and gets heavy. The kind of terrain that doesn't show up well on satellite maps. The canopy closes over and the gorges read flat when they're anything but. A bloke I met through a 4-wheel drive club had mentioned it once in passing. Said the granite formations down in the valley floor were worth the walk. Said it like that was all there was to say about it. I set off from the ridge track at first light with a heavy pack. 3 days food, 10 litres of water, full bivvy kit. The descent into the valley took most of the morning. Loose shale for the first 200 metres, then a band of spotted gum that gave way to dry rainforest, then the valley floor opened up and I stopped walking. I've seen granite country, but not like this. The boulders down there weren't scattered. They were stacked, monolithic, some of them 5-6 stories tall, smooth-sided and pale grey, sitting in the scrub like they'd been placed by something with a very long memory and no particular hurry. The faces of them were almost featureless. No cracks, no ledges, just vast curved surfaces that caught the morning light and threw it back at you. You couldn't shake the feeling they were oriented, that they were facing things. I stood at the edge of the open ground for a minute before I walked in, and I can't fully explain why I hesitated. Thoughtful. Just a reading you take of country sometimes, like a change in air pressure. I chalked it up to being tired and moved on. The walking in the valley was slower than I'd planned. The ground between the formations was choked with tie tree and wattle scrub, and the boulders forced constant detours. I kept thinking the open ground was just ahead, and it never quite was. By early afternoon, I'd covered maybe 4 kilometres in a straight line, but closer to 8 on foot, and when I finally found a clearing and checked my position, I was further in than I'd intended, significantly further. I sat on a flat rock and ate some dried apricots and did the math. The way back to the ridge was 2.5 hours in good light on clear ground. I had maybe 3 hours of proper light left, and the ground wasn't clear. I could push it, drop the pack weight by leaving food and water I'd need the next day, and probably make the ridge in the dark on a track I didn't know. Or I could find flat ground, roll out the swag, and walk out in the morning. It wasn't really a decision. It was just what the country had decided for me. I found a patch of level ground between 2 of the larger formations and made camp. The boulders on either side were close, 10, maybe 12 meters apart, and they rose sheer above me on both flanks, leaning slightly inward the way that granite does when it's been through enough weathering cycles. Behind me, the valley wall. In front of me, a narrow view, out through the scrub, maybe 50 meters of clear sight line before the wattle closed it off. I got the billy on, set up the swag, and watched the light go. It went fast. It always goes faster in a valley. Slowly, the birds stopped at dusk. That's normal, but usually there's a handover. The day birds quiet down and the night things start up. Frogs, owls, nightjars doing their churring thing in the distance. That night, there was nothing. The silence came down with the dark, and it was absolute. Not peaceful. Drawn out. Absolute. There's a difference, and your body knows it before your brain catches up. I boiled a second billy and sat with my hands around the cup, and I thought about what an old Gamilaroi man had told me, maybe 8 years before, when I'd been working survey fencing on a station near Inverell. We'd been talking about the granite country to the east, the deep valley systems that the station hands didn't much like to work in, and he'd gone quiet for a bit before he spoke. He said the clever men, the initiated men with real knowledge, the ones who carried things that ordinary people didn't carry, they'd use the high rock country for their heavy business that needed to be done away from camps, away from women and children, away from the uninitiated. He said some of that business left marks on country that didn't fade, that the shadows between the big rocks in those valleys weren't always just shadows. He said there were things that learned to wait in places like that. things that had been watching people pass through for a very long time, and had gotten good at it. He said the old people had a word for what happens when something that isn't alive learns to mimic the living well enough to be almost convincing. He said almost. I hadn't thought about that conversation in years. Sitting there with the fire down to coals and the granite walls rising up on both sides of me in the dark, I thought about it quite a lot. I put the fire out around 9 and got into the swag. The sky above the valley was extraordinary. No light pollution for 100 kilometers in any direction. The Milky Way running edge to edge across the gap between the boulders. I lay on my back and looked up at it and tried to let the size of it settle me down. It didn't work the way it usually does. The scale of the sky wasn't making me feel small in a good way. Size? It was making me feel exposed. I don't know what time it was when I heard it the first time. Late. The fire was cold and the dew had come down on the swag fabric. I'd been half asleep. That shallow kind of sleep you get when a part of you is still listening to country. The sound was the click of a buckle, specifically the double click of the sternum straps buckle on my pack. The one with the tension release. You press both sides in and it makes a very specific sound. A hard plastic click followed by a softer release. I'd done it probably 30 times that day. My hands knew that sound. It came from the crevice in the large boulder to my left. The one with the crack running up the base of it, wide enough that a person could press into it sideways. Maybe 10 feet from where I was lying? I went completely still. I told myself it was thermal expansion. Rock cooling down after the day's heat, contracting, making noise. Granite does that. I know it does that. Then it did it again. Twice, the exact same interval. The exact same two-part sound. I didn't move. I lay in the swag, and I did not move. And I became aware of something that I am struggling to write down in a way that makes sense. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a smell. It was more like a pressure. A weight in the air directly to my left, coming from the direction of that crevice, a density that hadn't been there before. Whispers. The feeling you get when there is something very large and very close that is not making any sound and is not moving and is simply present. I've been close to animals in the dark before. Big animals. Roost wombats. Once a feral pig that came through camp at Barrington and upended my food bag 2 feet from my head. I know what animal presence feels like. This was not that. I lay there for a long time. The pressure didn't move. It didn't shift or retreat. It just sat at that distance. Constant. Patient. Patient in a way that had nothing to do with waiting for something to happen and everything to do with having waited for an extremely long time already, with no particular investment in outcome. At some point, from the same direction, I heard my own breathing. Not similar to my breathing. Whispers. My breathing. The exact rhythm I'd been unconsciously keeping in the cold air. The slightly long exhale I do when I'm trying to stay calm. Whoever or whatever was doing it didn't rush it, didn't exaggerate it, just sat in that dark crack in 10,000-year-old rock and breathed my own breath back at me with a precision that made my stomach drop completely out of me. I did not sleep again. I lay perfectly still until the sky above the valley shifted from black to deep blue, and when there was just enough grey light to see the ground, I unzipped the swag, rolled it without shaking out the dew, stuffed it into the pack without folding it properly, and I walked out of that valley without stopping. I didn't look at the crevice. I made that decision early, and I stuck to it. I was back on the ridge track by 9 in the morning. I sat on a log in the full sun and drank the rest of my water and didn't move for about 20 minutes. I've gone back over it 100 times. Thermal contraction of the rock, some auditory trick of the valley acoustics, sleep deprivation, making patterns out of noise. I've run through all of it. I keep coming back to the breathing, the specific, personal, careful accuracy of it. I haven't been back into that valley. I don't think I will be. There are sections of country in this state that are old in a way that doesn't register on any map you can buy. Old in a way that means it was doing things long before we arrived, and whatever it was doing, it hasn't stopped. Some country tolerates visitors. Some country doesn't know what you are. And some country, the deep country, the valley floor country, hemmed in by granite that has been sitting there since before there were words for sitting. Whispers. Some country remembers that it doesn't have to tolerate anything,